I'll be honest, buying this farm felt like winning the lottery. Rolling fields, a creaky old barn that smelled like history, and a big empty sky that made you feel like anything was possible. I imagine waking up to the sunrise, planting rows of vegetables, letting my chickens wander freely, maybe even growing a pumpkin patch big enough to make my neighbors jealous. No HOA rules, no judgmental neighbors sneering at your mailbox color, just freedom. And I was in love. For the first few days, life on the farm was perfect. I spent hours exploring the property, poking through the barn, and wondering what secrets it held. I even gave names to the chickens, Henrietta, Cluck Norris, and Egbert, and they quickly became my unlikely companions. The breeze smelled like hay and earth, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. That peace, however, lasted about 3 blissful days. It started with the mailbox. A crisp, official-looking envelope sat there, glaring at me like a warning from the universe. I didn't recognize the sender at first, so I tore it open, and that's when I froze. It was an HOA letter. I laughed at first, surely it was a mistake, maybe they had the wrong address, right, wrong. The letter demanded annual HOA dues, community aesthetic contributions, and mandatory landscape inspections. I read it 3 times, hoping it would make sense the second or third time. Nope, it didn't, because here's the thing, I don't live in the HOA, my property isn't even close to their neighborhood, and yet here was this board of perfectly manicured lawns and Starbucks-fueled self-righteousness telling me I owed them hundreds of dollars. I stared at the paper, I laughed, I yelled at the chickens. Am I missing something? I said. Egbert clucked in sympathy. After a few minutes of stunned disbelief, I decided to call them. Surely, a simple phone call would clear this up. The HOA receptionist answered with a chipper tone that immediately made my blood boil. "Hello, HOA administration, how can I help you today?" she said. "Yes," I said, "I think you have the wrong property. I don't live in your HOA. Why am I getting this letter?" A pause, then with the same calm as someone delivering a death sentence, she said, "Oh, we've checked your property. It's within our jurisdiction. You are required to pay dues." I blinked. My jurisdiction? My jurisdiction? Since when did they have jurisdiction over a farm that isn't even on their map? The letter had threatened fines if I didn't pay, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I laughed loudly at the absurdity. Then I decided to do what any slightly unhinged person would do. I started drafting a response. Not a polite one, not a confused one. A response that screamed in a very measured and sarcastic tone that they were full of it. But I also realized something scary. The letter didn't just demand money, it implied power, control. Even though I was outside their neighborhood, somehow they thought they could boss me around, and that was a line I was never going to let them cross. That's when I felt the first surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about money, it wasn't about the letter, it was about principle. And I have to admit, the idea of fighting back, of showing them that no self-important board could intimidate me, made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Little did I know, that first letter was just the opening salvo. The storm was coming, and unlike the gentle breezes that whispered across my farm fields, this storm would not be quiet. I didn't know it yet, but my life on this farm, which I thought would be peaceful and private, was about to turn into a full-blown battle with the HOA. A battle that would test my patience, my wits, and surprisingly, my sense of humor. And that's when I realized something terrifying and exciting at the same time. I wasn't just buying a farm, I was buying a war. After that first letter, I spent the next few days in a mix of disbelief and simmering anger. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking, maybe it's just a clerical error. Surely they'll fix it once I call. I was wrong. The first call was frustrating, to say the least. I dialed the HOA office, and after navigating a labyrinth of robotic menus, I finally got a human. She sounded calm, almost smug, like she knew she had me trapped in a game I didn't even know I was playing. "I see here that your property is within the HOA's jurisdiction," she said, her tone as casual as if she were ordering a latte. I laughed nervously at first, then angrily. "Excuse me, my property is outside your neighborhood. Look at the map, I own the farm down the old mill road. That's 5 miles from your jurisdiction." A pause, a long ominous pause. "Well," she said finally, "our maps indicate otherwise. You are required to pay dues." I hung up, staring at the phone in disbelief. 5 miles? They were claiming jurisdiction over a farm that didn't even have a paved driveway connecting it to their neighborhood, and apparently no logic, state law, or common sense could stop them. The next day, I received a second letter. This one was more formal, stamped with a gold seal and the words "Final Notice" in terrifyingly bold letters. It stated that failure to pay dues could result in fines, legal action, and get this, community enforcement measures. Community enforcement measures? I imagine them sending a platoon of HOA board members in golf carts to patrol my barn. Or maybe they'd send a team to inspect my chickens for avian decorum. My sense of humor kicked in just in time to stop me from throwing the letter into the fire. But beneath the humor was a growing unease. They weren't just joking. HOAs have power more than you'd think. They can levy fines, file liens, and in some absurd cases, even attempt to seize property. And here they were, ready to flex that power over me, a guy who just wanted to enjoy his farm in peace. Determined to fight back, I did what any sane person would do. I started researching. Maps, property deeds, state laws. The more I read, the more my blood boiled. They had no right to claim my farm, but they were banking on people not knowing the law. Typical HOA move. Then came the neighbors. Some were supportive, others curious, and one particularly nosy woman leaned over her fence and whispered, "They'll get you to pay eventually. That's how it works." I gritted my teeth and smiled. "Not if I can help it," I said. I also realized I needed allies. My first recruit was a local lawyer, grizzled, caffeinated, and a little eccentric, who looked like he'd survived a dozen HOA battles before. He promised to help me fight back, though he warned me that HOAs could be petty, vindictive, and surprisingly creative when it came to finding ways to intimidate people. "Bring maps," he said, "bring evidence, and bring patience. You're going to need all three." I gathered everything I had: property deeds, tax documents, photographs of the farm, and even old aerial maps showing exactly where my land began and ended. I started drafting letters, carefully worded but sharp enough to sting if they tried to push me around. But just when I thought I was ready, I received an email that made my heart skip a beat. The HOA had escalated. They weren't just sending letters anymore, they were hinting at legal action. Threats of lawsuits, claims of unpaid dues, and fines that could snowball if ignored. That's when I realized this wasn't just a bureaucratic annoyance anymore. This was personal. And if they thought I was going to roll over quietly, they were about to learn a very important lesson. I don't back down from a fight. Little did I know this was just the beginning. The letters, the threats, the smug board members, they were all moving into position. And I was about to step onto their turf, armed with nothing but maps, the law, and a stubborn streak that refused to quit. The farm, which I had imagined as my peaceful retreat, was about to become a battlefield, and I had no choice but to fight or lose everything. After that second ominous letter and the hint of lawsuits, I realized one thing: ignoring the HOA was no longer an option. This wasn't just a minor annoyance anymore. This was war, and if I wanted to survive it, I needed a plan. I sat at my kitchen table, maps spread out in a chaotic mess, papers piled high, and a half-empty cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The farm was quiet outside, too quiet, like the calm before a storm. I had to prepare. First, I needed allies. My first recruit was a local lawyer named Frank. He looked like he'd been through a dozen HOA battles and probably survived all of them with coffee and sarcasm as his weapons of choice. Frank had one eyebrow permanently raised, as if the world was constantly trying to annoy him, and honestly, he seemed perfect for this fight. "Maps, deeds, anything showing property lines," he said, scanning my documents. "Also pictures, I want evidence of what's yours, clearly marked. HOAs love to get people confused." I nodded seriously, trying to ignore the growing sense of absurdity. This was my life now, plotting war with a neighborhood committee that wore polos and drove golf carts. Next, I contacted a neighbor who had once fought her own HOA years ago. She called it the tyranny of manicured lawns. Her advice was simple but golden: document everything, don't let them bully you, and always keep your sense of humor. So we started gathering evidence. Old tax records, aerial maps, photographs showing exactly where my property began and ended down to the last fence post. I even went so far as to mark my chickens' roaming territory on a map. If the HOA tried to claim my chickens were their community chickens, I'd be ready. Then came the brainstorming session. I sat at the kitchen table with Frank and my neighbor, plotting every possible HOA move and how I'd counter it. There was coffee, lots of it, and enough sarcasm to fill a small stadium. "What if they send inspectors?" I asked, half joking. "Then we document their visit," Frank said. "If they step onto your property illegally, it's harassment. If they photograph your farm without consent, it's evidence. Everything counts." I laughed nervously. I feel like we're assembling a superhero team minus the capes, mostly snacks though. The more we planned, the more I realized how absurdly petty some HOAs can be. They thrive on fear, on intimidation, and on people being too confused to fight back. And I was about to prove them wrong. But even with a plan, there was that creeping doubt in the back of my mind. HOAs can be relentless. They send letters, levy fines, and if you push back, they escalate, and this one clearly had no intention of backing down. The suspense started creeping into my days. Every mail delivery felt like a potential ambush. Every email alert made my heart skip a beat, and when the sun set over the farm, I couldn't help but imagine board members in their crisp khakis plotting their next move like villains in a B-movie. Then came the first direct confrontation. The HOA sent a representative to my property. I saw the small car pull up perfectly clean like they were invading my farm with style. A well-dressed man stepped out, clipboard in hand, and I braced myself. He walked up to the barn and peered around, clearly trying to intimidate me. I smiled. "Here to collect dues for my chickens?" I asked deadpan. He frowned, clearly unsure how to respond. We're just verifying property compliance." I nodded solemnly. Yes, I see. Would you like a guided tour of the boundaries? I've marked them in highlighter and tape for your convenience." The poor guy blinked, muttered something about community standards, and retreated to his car. I watched him drive away, feeling victorious, but also realizing this was just the beginning. I knew I was going to have to fight smarter, faster, and wittier than they expected. Every letter, every visit, every threat would be a move on a chessboard, and I was determined to checkmate them. By the time the sun set over my fields, I was exhausted but exhilarated. The farm was mine, the chickens were mine, and now the battle lines were drawn. The HOA thought they could intimidate me, they thought I'd roll over, they thought wrong. Because now I was ready, and if they wanted a fight, they'd get one. I still remember the morning I decided to show up at the HOA office in person. I told myself it was about being reasonable, about calmly explaining that my farm wasn't theirs to control. But deep down, I knew it was also about staring down the people who thought they could bully me from miles away. I wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and my trusty boots. My neighbor warned me, "Don't go in there expecting niceties, they're professional at condescension." I laughed nervously. The HOA office was smaller than I imagined, one of those generic strip mall locations with beige walls, fake plants, and motivational posters that read things like "Curb appeal is happiness." There were 3 board members sitting at a long, polished table, sipping what I assumed was overpriced coffee and judging me the second I walked in. One of them, a woman in a perfectly pressed blazer, leaned forward and smiled in a way that was definitely meant to be intimidating. "We're here to discuss your property dues," she said. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Actually, we're here to discuss how my property isn't in your HOA and why I won't be paying dues for something I don't belong to." The room went silent, and I swear for a moment I could hear the motivational posters mocking me. Then came the condescension. "Well, according to our records, your property is within our jurisdiction," said another board member, a man with a tie so tight it looked like it was strangling him. "We expect all property owners in this area to contribute to community maintenance and fees." I blinked. My brain was running through every legal argument, every map, every aerial photo I had. But instead of launching immediately into an aggressive debate, I let the absurdity of the situation hit me. "So let me get this straight," I said, leaning on the edge of the table. "You expect me to pay dues for a farm 5 miles outside your neighborhood, for the maintenance of roads, lawns, and sidewalks I never use?" One of the board members sniffed, literally sniffed like I had insulted their entire way of life. "Well, it's for the good of the community." I couldn't help myself. The good of the community? My chickens are more community-minded than you all combined. At least they provide eggs. The woman in the blazer's eyes narrowed. "We're serious about this." "Oh, I'm serious too," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I've got property deeds, tax records, and maps showing the exact boundaries of my land, all of which prove this farm is not in your jurisdiction. But by all means, if you want to continue wasting my time, I'm happy to let a judge decide." Their expressions shifted, shock, confusion, maybe even a hint of panic. I could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads. They weren't used to people standing up to them, especially not someone outside their little controlled world. Then came the threat. "If you refuse to pay, we can take legal action," said the man in the tie, clearly trying to regain authority. I smiled politely, hiding the surge of adrenaline. "Go ahead, send the paperwork, I'm ready." The board shuffled papers, whispered among themselves, and for a few tense moments I thought they might actually storm out in a huff. Then finally the woman in the blazer said, "We'll be in touch." And with that, I left, but walking back to my truck, I felt the first real rush of victory. I had stood up to them. I had made it clear that I wasn't intimidated. But as I drove back across my farm, I realized something. This was only the beginning. They weren't going to let this go. HOAs have a way of escalating things slowly, systematically, and ruthlessly. Letters would come, maybe legal threats, maybe more inspections, whatever it took to intimidate me into compliance. And I knew I had to be ready. The chickens clucked as if in agreement, and I laughed. Don't worry, guys, we're in this together. That night, I spread out my maps again, reviewing every boundary line, every property document. I started drafting letters preemptively, imagining every absurd argument they might throw at me and crafting responses that would shut them down before they even opened their mouths. By the time the sun set over my fields, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. I had faced the first confrontation and survived. More importantly, I had sent a clear message. I wasn't afraid, I wasn't backing down, and I certainly wasn't paying dues for someone else's manicured lawns. But as I locked the barn and headed inside, I knew this was just round one. The HOA would be back, and when they did, I had to be ready to fight smarter, faster, and with even more determination than before. Because in this battle, peace and quiet would come at a price, and I wasn't about to pay it. I thought the first confrontation at the HOA office was the worst of it. I was wrong. The very next week, my mailbox, already a source of dread, delivered a thick envelope stamped legal notice. My hands shook slightly as I tore it open. Inside was a formal lawsuit. They were suing me for unpaid HOA dues and threatening to levy fines that could spiral into thousands of dollars. I blinked, I read it twice. Then I read it a third time just to make sure it wasn't some kind of elaborate prank. It was. The HOA had officially escalated to war. I paced across the barn, muttering to myself, "Unpaid dues? My property isn't even in your neighborhood. You think I'm paying for your fancy fountains and perfectly trimmed hedges?" The chickens clucked at me, probably in judgment. It was time to fight back harder. I wasn't just going to respond to letters and hope for the best. I decided to take the absurdity public. First, I documented everything. Every letter, every email, every ridiculous demand they had made over the past month went into a binder I jokingly labeled HOA, the Comedy of Errors. I even included photographs of my farm showing where it clearly ended before their claimed jurisdiction began. There were maps, fences, and even a few shots of my chickens wandering freely. Then I started sharing the story carefully on social media. I didn't call anyone names or attack them personally, but I narrated the absurdity of being sued for a farm that wasn't even in the HOA. To my surprise, people loved it. Local news outlets reached out. Memes started circulating online, HOA versus Farm Rebel. The humor wasn't just for the audience, it was for me. Fighting an HOA can be exhausting, and laughter became my armor. Every post, every comment, every retweet was a little victory. People started sending tips and advice. Some offered their own HOA horror stories. Others cheered me on, calling me the hero of all property owners who don't want to be bullied by a neighborhood committee. Meanwhile, the legal preparations were ramping up. Frank, my lawyer, was in his element. He reviewed the lawsuit, pointing out all the ways the HOA had overstepped its authority. "They're grasping at straws," he said, sipping coffee like it was liquid courage. "This is ridiculous, and the judge is going to see it too." I also realized that the HOA thrived on intimidation. They counted on confusion, fear, and most importantly, inaction. Their goal wasn't justice, it was compliance. They hoped I'd pay up just to avoid the hassle, but that wasn't going to happen. Then came the first sign of their desperation. They sent a certified letter demanding access to my property for inspections, claiming that I was violating some imaginary aesthetic code. The letter was threatening, formal, and completely absurd. I stared at it for a moment, then laughed out loud. "You want to inspect my property? Fine, bring your cameras, your clipboards, and your measuring tape. I'll be ready." I even started preparing a humorous yet firm response. Every point they made, no matter how ridiculous, would be countered with facts, maps, and photos. If they tried to claim my chickens were a nuisance, I had photos proving they stayed well within their own space. If they claimed my driveway wasn't maintained, I had time-stamped photos of me fixing it myself. The suspense was constant. Every knock on the door, every mailbox delivery, every email notification made my heart skip a beat. This wasn't just paperwork anymore, it was psychological warfare. The HOA was testing me, trying to see if I'd crack under pressure. But instead, I was learning how to fight smarter, anticipate their moves, and keep my cool. By the end of the week, the situation had escalated into a full-blown standoff. The HOA had filed the lawsuit, threatened inspections, and made it clear they weren't backing down. And I had become a local legend, the defiant farmer standing up to bureaucracy, armed with maps, legal documents, and a sense of humor sharp enough to cut through their self-importance. I knew one thing for sure: the next encounter would be bigger, more serious, and likely more absurd, but I also knew I wasn't alone. My lawyer, my neighbors, and even the online community had my back, and this time I wasn't just defending my farm, I was preparing to win the battle outright. The farm that was once a peaceful retreat had become a battlefield, but for the first time I felt ready. The stakes were higher than ever, and the suspense hung over every sunrise and sunset like a storm cloud waiting to burst, and somehow I was excited. Because I knew this fight wasn't just about dues, it was about proving that no HOA could bully me into submission. The morning of the court date, I felt a mix of nerves and excitement that I hadn't felt in years. My farm was quiet, the sun just peeking over the horizon, and I could hear Henrietta and Cluck Norris clucking like they were cheering me on. At least that's what I chose to believe. I dressed carefully, jeans and boots were fine for the farm, but court demanded something a little more respectable. A button-up shirt, my cleanest jacket, and a sense of determination that I hoped would be visible even through my slightly nervous smile. Frank, my lawyer, gave me a thumbs up. "Remember," he said, "sarcasm is a weapon, facts are your shield, and don't let them intimidate you." Walking into the courthouse, I could feel the tension immediately. Board members from the HOA were there, looking smug and overly confident. I could practically see the gears turning in their heads. They thought they were about to win, that their fancy letterhead and perfectly polished arguments would scare me into submission. The courtroom itself was quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. I set my maps, deeds, and photo evidence on the table in front of me, making sure everything was perfectly organized. Every document was a bullet in my arsenal. The HOA attorney began their argument with a confident tone. "Your Honor, the defendant resides within the HOA's jurisdiction and has failed to pay the required dues for the maintenance of our community." I could feel my blood pressure rising, but I kept my calm. Frank leaned over and whispered, "Watch their confidence, they're nervous about the facts they can't dispute." When it was my turn, I stood up, took a deep breath, and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, my property is clearly outside the HOA boundaries. I have property deeds, tax records, and aerial maps that demonstrate this. I do not, nor have I ever, resided within their jurisdiction. I have not used their roads, benefited from their landscaping, or sought any services from this HOA, yet I am being sued for dues I do not owe." I laid out every piece of evidence. I showed photos marking property lines, maps highlighting where my farm began and ended, and even a few amusing shots of my chickens roaming my land, proving that I certainly wasn't infringing on any HOA property. The judge listened carefully, occasionally glancing at the HOA board, who were starting to look less smug and more uncomfortable. I could sense their growing frustration. They were used to people cowering, not standing up with hard evidence and a little humor. At one point, the board attorney tried to argue, "Well, there's a clause." Frank immediately interjected, "Objection, Your Honor, that clause only applies to properties within the defined community. It does not and cannot legally extend beyond HOA boundaries." The judge nodded and asked them to move on. You could feel the room tense with every exchange, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then came the best part. I added a little touch of humor, not because I wanted to undermine the seriousness, but because the absurdity demanded it. "If it helps, Your Honor, I am willing to provide guided tour of the property boundaries to any board member who doubts them. We can measure my chickens' roaming area and even take soil samples if necessary." The judge smiled slightly, and I saw it, the first crack in the board's confidence. They weren't expecting someone to face them with facts and wit. By the time both sides finished presenting, the suspense in the courtroom was palpable. Even the bailiff seemed to lean forward a little, curious how this would end. Everyone knew that HOA battles could drag on endlessly, but with the evidence laid bare, it was hard to argue against reality. The judge took a long, deliberate pause before speaking. "Based on the documents presented, it is clear that the property in question lies outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The claim for unpaid dues is dismissed." I felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly knocked me back in my chair. The board members' faces were a mix of shock, frustration, and, dare I say it, a little humiliation. Walking out of the courthouse, I could feel the adrenaline still coursing through me. I had faced the first major battle, armed with nothing but evidence, determination, and a touch of humor. The HOA had been confident, pompous, and intimidating, but in the end, facts won. But as I drove back to my farm, I reminded myself, HOAs can be persistent. This might be a victory, but knowing them, they could try one last ridiculous tactic before they gave up entirely. And I was ready. Because one thing was certain, I wasn't just defending my farm anymore. I was proving that no bureaucratic nonsense could intimidate someone willing to stand up and fight for what's theirs. The farm that once promised peace had become a battlefield, but for the first time I felt in control, and I knew that the real victory, freedom from their absurd demands, was finally within reach. I thought the courtroom battle would be the final chapter. I walked out feeling victorious, a little like Rocky after the big fight, except my gloves were maps and legal documents. I imagined going home, planting my pumpkin patch, letting my chickens roam freely, and finally enjoying the peace I'd been craving. But HOAs don't quit that easily. A week later, I received another letter. I stared at it suspiciously like it might bite me. The envelope had no return address, just the HOA logo stamped in gold at the top. My hands shook slightly as I opened it. Inside was the most absurd claim yet. My chickens were supposedly violating a community avian aesthetic code. Yes, you read that right. They were claiming that my free-roaming chickens were somehow a threat to neighborhood beauty standards, even though my farm was miles away from the nearest HOA home. I laughed so hard I nearly fell off the porch. Henrietta and Cluck Norris clucked as if mocking me, and Egbert stared in judgment. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, holding the letter up like it was a prop in a bad comedy. But beneath the laughter, I felt that familiar rush of determination. They were grasping at straws now. The lawsuit had failed, the inspections had failed, now they were using chickens as their final desperate tactic. I knew this was their last move before conceding defeat, or so I hoped. I called Frank immediately. "You're not going to believe this," I said, chuckling but keeping my tone serious. "They're claiming my chickens are a code violation." Frank laughed. "Well, that's a first, but don't worry, this is the easiest case you've ever had. You've already proven your property is outside their jurisdiction. Chickens or no chickens, this is ridiculous." Still, I had to handle it carefully. HOAs can be sneaky, so I drafted a firm, no-nonsense response. I cited property boundaries, previous court rulings, and of course the absurdity of regulating free-roaming chickens on a private farm. I attached photos of the chickens, maps of the property, and even a diagram showing exactly where the HOA's influence ended. The suspense was electric as I sent the certified letter. I imagined the board reading it in real time, flipping through my maps and photos, realizing that once again I was untouchable. A few days later, I got the response. They backed down. No lawsuit, no threats, no avian enforcement team at my barn. They had finally realized that continuing this battle would only make them look foolish, and honestly, it already had. Walking back across my farm that evening, I felt a mixture of relief and triumph. The sunset painted the fields in gold, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe freely. I let my chickens wander, laughed at their antics, and even started sketching plans for the pumpkin patch I had been imagining since part 1. But I couldn't resist a little humor at the HOA's expense. I took a photo of Henrietta perched proudly on a fence post, Egbert pecking nearby, and captioned it, "Community Avian Aesthetic, nailed it." Posting it online, I felt a wave of satisfaction as likes and comments poured in. People loved it. They were rooting for the little guy standing up to bureaucracy, and my chickens had become unexpected heroes in the saga. Even more satisfying was seeing the board's reactions. From the snippets online, I could tell they were flustered. Emails went unanswered, and there was a visible hesitation in their tone whenever anyone mentioned the farm rebel. They had underestimated me from the beginning, and it had cost them their dignity. As I closed the barn door that night, I reflected on what had just happened. This wasn't just about dues or chickens or legal boundaries. It was about standing up to absurd authority, about refusing to be bullied, and about fighting for what's right, even if it's uncomfortable, inconvenient, or downright ridiculous. I had won the battle, but more importantly, I had won something deeper: peace of mind. The farm was mine, the freedom was mine, and my sense of humor had survived intact. And as I sat down to relax, I couldn't help but smile. I knew HOAs would always exist, always try to control things, always send letters threatening fines, but I had learned something crucial. If you fight back with facts, patience, and a little bit of humor, even the most absurd bureaucracy can be defeated. Henrietta clucked as if agreeing, Egbert strutted proudly, and Cluck Norris remained unimpressed. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. Because sometimes, victory isn't just about winning the legal battle. It's about reclaiming your life, your farm, and your sanity from people who thought they could take it away. And now, finally, I could truly enjoy it. The week after the HOA finally backed down felt surreal. For the first time in months, I could walk across my farm without glancing nervously at the mailbox. No threatening letters, no ridiculous demands, no avian aesthetic codes, just peace. Real, hard-won peace. I spent the mornings checking on the chickens, letting them roam freely without worrying about some overzealous board member sending a note about community violations. Henrietta strutted across the yard with an air of superiority. Egbert followed her like a loyal sidekick, and Cluck Norris remained unimpressed, as always. But somehow they all seemed to understand the gravity of what we had just survived. The victory was more than legal. It was personal. Every time I walked past the barn, every time I opened a drawer and saw the maps, deeds, and letters carefully filed away, I felt a surge of pride. I had stood up to bureaucracy and won not with brute force, but with preparation, patience, and a healthy dose of humor. I even went back online to post a final update for all the people who had been following my saga. I wrote about the absurdity of the HOA, the ridiculous chicken claims, and the lessons I had learned. The response was overwhelming. Comments poured in, congratulations, advice, and people sharing their own HOA nightmares. Somehow my little farm fight had become an inspiration. But the real triumph came the day I finally sat back in my rocking chair on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. No letters, no legal threats, just the golden light stretching across the horizon, my chickens wandering contentedly, and the wind rustling through the tall grass. It was a moment of clarity. I realized that what I had thought would be a simple, peaceful retreat had transformed into something much bigger. My farm had become a symbol not just of independence, but of standing up for what's right. I had defended my home, my property, and my sanity, and in doing so, I had found a deeper sense of freedom than I ever imagined. There were still lessons learned, of course. HOAs can be relentless. They can send letters that make your blood boil, inspect imaginary violations, and even try to regulate your chickens. But I learned that preparation, patience, and persistence can overcome even the most absurd bureaucracy, and a little humor never hurts. In fact, it might just be the most powerful weapon of all. As the days passed, life slowly returned to normal. I started planting the pumpkin patch I had been planning since I bought the farm. I built a small coop for the chickens, giving them a safe place to sleep without worrying about imaginary HOA rules. I even started a small vegetable garden, something I had always dreamed of but hadn't had time for in the chaos of city life. Visitors came by occasionally, friends and family who wanted to see the farm and hear the story firsthand. I told it with humor, exaggerating the absurdity of being sued over chickens and imaginary dues. Everyone laughed, and some even shook their heads in disbelief. I can't believe that actually happened, they'd say. I would have paid just to avoid the headache. But I didn't pay, I had fought back, and that made all the difference. One evening, as I closed the barn and walked back toward the house, I glanced up at the sky. The stars were bright, and the wind carried the scent of hay and earth. I felt a deep, satisfying sense of accomplishment. The battle with the HOA was over, the farm was mine, and my freedom, my real, tangible freedom, was intact. I laughed quietly to myself, thinking about the letters, the visits, and the absurdity of it all. If anyone ever tells you that small battles don't matter, I'll tell them this story. Sometimes it's not just about paying dues or following rules. Sometimes it's about standing up, fighting back, and proving that no bureaucracy, no matter how pompous, can control your life if you refuse to let it. Henrietta clucked in agreement, Egbert strutted proudly, and Cluck Norris continued his unimpressed gaze. But somehow that felt fitting. We had survived the storm together, and now, finally, we could enjoy the calm. And that's when it hit me, this was more than a farm, this was freedom, this was victory, and this was home. I took a deep breath, smiled, and whispered to no one in particular, we did it. The mailbox stayed empty the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Peace had finally returned to the farm, and for the first time in a long time, I knew I could truly relax. Because no HOA, no letters, no imaginary codes could ever take this from me. The farm and my sanity were finally safe. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.